Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Europe is planning to ban Russian gas on a tidy legal schedule, just as global LNG supply is getting shaken. The contradiction is obvious. The consequence is not abstract. When supply tightens, your bills rise and your industry loses its edge. Here's the uncomfortable question. Are we running energy policy, or are we just writing documents and hoping the market cooperates? Let's be honest. Gas is boring. That's why it runs the world. And today's story is simple. Europe wants a controlled divorce from Russian gas. Russia is floating the idea of leaving first. And the LNG market, the replacement plan, is suddenly facing disruptions in the Gulf and the Eastern Mediterranean. If you think this is only politics, ask yourself why prices react faster than parliaments. The source text you provided comes from a Russian energy discussion. I'm not here to cheer for any side. I'm here to translate the logic into plain English, because the logic is what hits your wallet. So let's start with what was said. The claim is that Russia's president told the government to explore the option of refusing gas supplies to Europe completely. Not a long document, not a detailed decree in the material you gave me, more like a short public remark, framed as thinking out loud, followed by an instruction, work it out. One sentence can be a policy signal when your product is energy. And in energy, signals matter, because energy contracts are built on one fragile thing: confidence that tomorrow's delivery will happen. So what does this signal mean? It means Russia is considering flipping the timeline. Instead of waiting for Europe to gradually ban Russian gas, Russia may consider cutting the relationship earlier, on its own terms. And that leads us to the part Europe doesn't enjoy discussing in public. Europe already set a timeline. In the discussion you provided, they list a phased approach with specific dates. A ban on certain short-term Russian LNG flows from late April. A ban on short-term pipeline supply from mid-June. A stop to long-term LNG contracts from the start of the next year. And an end to long-term pipeline supply later, with a final cutoff date. You don't need to love the dates. You just need to understand the structure. Europe isn't saying, stop tomorrow. Europe is saying, we will stop you in steps. And if someone tells you they will cut you off later, you start thinking about cutting them off first. That's not ideology. That's basic risk management. Now, why would Europe do this? Because Europe wants to reduce dependency. It wants to reduce the strategic risk of relying on a supplier it views as hostile and unpredictable. That is the stated logic. But here comes the first contradiction. Europe is not a single consumer with a single interest. Inside the EU, some countries are positioned to live without Russian gas more easily. Others are not. Some have LNG terminals, interconnectors, and alternatives. Others are still trapped by geography, infrastructure, and history. And that's why the source mentions Hungary and Slovakia and their legal pushback. When Brussels drafts bans, some member states look for exemptions, delays, or legal fights. That's the reality of Europe. Unity on paper, friction in practice. When the bloc is divided internally, leverage comes from the weak links, not the loud speeches. Now let's flip the lens. What is Russia's angle here? The argument in your source is essentially this: why keep supplying Europe while Europe is openly designing a staged exit? Why tolerate a sequence where short-term contracts are refused, then medium-term, then long-term, and then everything, while still expecting deliveries in the meantime? If your partner is preparing to leave, you either negotiate a clean breakup now, or you accept a slow, messy breakup later. And Russia's cut-first idea is a way to avoid the slow mess. Now pause. This is where people often say, so Russia will do it, and Europe will suffer. Not so fast. Gas is not a switch, it's a chain. If Russia cuts supplies to Europe, Russia loses revenue. Europe loses supply. Both sides face costs. The only question is who can absorb the pain better, and who can shift the pain onto someone else, because that's what states do. They shift pain. Here's a sharp reality check. In energy politics, the public gets the bill. So what happens if Russian gas flows shrink further? To answer that, we need one boring but decisive number from your source: scale. Your text gives a baseline for European gas consumption. In 2019, before the pandemic, EU gas consumption is described as about 410 billion cubic meters. After the crisis period begins, the number falls. In the discussion, they frame consumption in 2025 as about 330 billion cubic meters. That drop is massive, and it's not all efficiency and clever technology. Some of it is simply reduced industrial output and demand destruction. You can call it substitution, you can call it success, but when factories stop running, it also looks like deindustrialization. And then comes the number that quietly decides leverage. The discussion estimates that Russian supplies are still about 15% of EU gas in 2025. They translate that into roughly 46 to 47 billion cubic meters. Because losing 46 billion cubic meters is not the whole system, but it is the difference between a comfortable market and a tight market. And energy crises do not require total collapse. They require stress at the margin. Prices are set at the margin. Political panic is set at the margin. So if Europe loses that last chunk of Russian supply, Europe needs replacements. And this is where the second contradiction enters. Europe's replacement plan is heavily dependent on LNG cargoes. It depends on global supply being available and global logistics functioning. And your source text argues that Europe's phase-out schedule was built on two expectations: increased supply coming from the United States through new projects in 2026, and additional capacity coming from Qatar later in the year. Again, we don't need to worship the plan. We need to understand what it depends on. It depends on new supply arriving on time. Energy schedules are famous for one thing. Now add geopolitics. Your source claims Qatar declared force majeure due to military conflict in the Persian Gulf, and that around 80 million tons of LNG capacity disappears from the market. Even if you don't accept every detail as perfect, the direction is clear. A major supplier becomes uncertain, and uncertainty in a tight market behaves like a shortage. In the same discussion, they frame it as a loss that equals roughly a couple of large LNG cargoes per day not being available. Whether you like the math or not, the meaning is simple. Fewer cargoes chasing the same buyers. And buyers don't negotiate politely in LNG. They bid. When a market tightens, policy becomes an auction. Then the source adds another pressure point. They talk about Israel suspending production at the Leviathan field, the operator complying, and pipeline supplies to Jordan and Egypt being interrupted. The key for Europe is not the local politics. The key is what happens next. Egypt is described as an LNG producer that uses gas to feed LNG plants. If Egypt loses feed gas and becomes a buyer instead, global LNG demand rises. Your source mentions an additional 10 to 12 million tons of LNG demand in that scenario. And then they broaden the picture. Beyond Qatar, the Gulf also includes LNG producers like the UAE and Bahrain, with a combined figure described as around 15 to 20 million tons per year. They paint a scenario where disruptions across multiple Gulf producers could remove nearly 100 million tons from global LNG availability, which they characterize as roughly a quarter of global production. That is the kind of scenario that turns energy policy into emergency economics. Now let's connect this back to Europe. Europe wants to cut Russian gas. Fine. That means Europe wants more LNG. Also fine. But if LNG supply becomes constrained at the same time, Europe competes with Asia and potentially with new buyers in the Middle East and North Africa. And Europe is not the only one bidding. Europe is bidding with public pressure, voter anger, and industrial fragility. In practice, Europe pays. This is where the cynicism becomes unavoidable. European institutions talk about decarbonization, hydrogen strategies, and the grand future. But the basic system still needs gas for three reasons: heating, industry, and flexible power generation when renewables don't deliver. You can build wind, you can build solar, you should, but you can't rewrite winter, and you can't negotiate with a calm, high-pressure system that kills wind for days. So the real risk for Europe is not no gas forever. The risk is spikes, volatility, and emergency measures. And volatility is what kills small businesses and marginal industries. Large corporations hedge, governments subsidize, households and SMEs absorb the pain. Now let's look at the political layer inside Europe, because it matters. Your source highlights Hungary as a case where supplies may be preserved. The reasoning is Hungary pays on time. It follows the payment mechanism introduced in 2022, and it acts like a reliable partner in the Russian framing. They also mention Slovakia. The point isn't to judge Hungary or Slovakia. The point is to recognize what this reveals. Europe's official position may be phase out Russian gas, but some member states still want the molecules. And when a system is under stress, the countries closest to the pain will do what they must to reduce it. That's how you end up with legal battles, exemptions, and quiet side deals. Energy solidarity is real until it becomes expensive. Now let's add the contract problem, because this is where people misunderstand how messy this can get. If Europe bans imports through regulation, buyers may claim they are legally unable to take delivery. If Russia cuts supply through a state decision, sellers may claim force majeure. And then you enter the world of arbitration, penalties, and lawsuits. Your source mentions long-term LNG contracts connected to a major Russian LNG project, and the idea that contracts can bind supply far into the future. Whether the exact end here in the discussion is perfectly stated or not, the concept stands. Long-term contracts exist, and breaking them is not frictionless. Contracts look strong until politics enters the room, and when politics enters the contract, lawyers get rich, and the rest of us get higher bills. Now, the Russian side also has its own constraints. Can Russia redirect LNG away from Europe? The source suggests yes, pointing to supplies going to China and a claim that cargoes are ending up at the same regasification terminal, implying a strategy of controlling the destination infrastructure. The idea is simple. If you own or control the terminal, sanctions and restrictions become easier to manage. Control of choke points beats control of headlines. But they also admit something important. LNG is not one technology. It's a chain. Liquefaction itself, cryogenic storage tanks at plants, specialized tanks and carriers, regasification terminals. If you can't build or access each link reliably, we will pivot everything becomes wishful thinking. And in a sanction-heavy environment, every missing component becomes expensive, slow, and vulnerable. So yes, Russia can pivot, but pivoting is not free. Gas is not an app. Now let's bring this closer to home with the Lithuania and Baltics lens. Lithuania is not a giant state that can insulate itself from European market volatility with unlimited fiscal tools. We are part of the EU market. Prices travel, risk travels. Even if you are not buying Russian gas directly, you pay for the stress in the system through price levels and volatility. Small states don't escape big market shocks. And the Baltics, like many smaller European economies, carry a particular vulnerability. We have less industrial margin to absorb prolonged high energy costs. When energy becomes expensive, a large economy can subsidize longer. A small economy must choose faster. And that choice is usually between public finances and competitiveness. 3 goals, 1 budget. Now let's talk about the human part, because that's where policy becomes reality. When gas gets expensive, everything downstream becomes expensive. Heating costs rise, electricity costs rise in gas-linked markets. Food costs rise because fertilizer and processing costs rise. Small firms lose margins. Some industries reduce output or shift production. And then governments step in with support measures, caps, subsidies, and emergency funds. Subsidy is not a solution. It is a time delay. If you hide the price today, you still pay later through taxes, debt, or inflation. So the real debate is not ban or not ban. The real debate is who pays and how fast. Now I want to return to the 15% figure, because that's the leverage point. If the EU is consuming around 330 billion cubic meters, and Russia supplies around 46 to 47 billion cubic meters, then the final slice is big enough to matter when the market is stressed. If LNG is abundant, Europe can replace it without drama. If LNG is disrupted, Europe pays in higher prices, and the politics follows. The last 15% is where the shouting starts. And now the darker irony from your source, the suggestion that Russia would be helping Europe implement its decarbonization and green strategy by removing gas from the equation. There is some cruel truth in that irony. When energy is cheap, green policy can be sold as progress. When energy is expensive, green policy becomes a political liability. And that is why energy shocks reshape politics faster than almost anything else. People don't riot over abstract ideology. They riot over bills and jobs. So, what do we conclude from all this? Here's my cold summary. Europe's plan is bureaucratic and staged. Russia's response is strategic and opportunistic. The LNG market is fragile and geopolitical, and the consumer is the shock absorber. If Russia cuts early, Europe faces tighter conditions sooner. If Europe keeps the timeline and enforces it, Russia prepares to redirect what it can and keep compliant buyers as exceptions where it suits. Either way, the so-called controlled divorce risks turning into a messy breakup driven by global LNG volatility. This is not a morality play, it's a logistics and incentives problem. Now, one short request. If this is useful, subscribe and tell me what you're seeing in your country. Because what I'm watching across Europe is a familiar pattern. Elites demand sacrifice. They promise it will be short. They insist it is necessary. And they rarely pay the same price personally. When that happens, it's usually a con. So here's the question I want you to answer in the comments. If your country had to choose in a tight market between perfect policy and affordable energy, what would it actually choose? Good day and good luck.